This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. This is our 25th episode, which is very exciting. Always like a number like that. But also it's going to be the last episode of the year. But it's going to be an end of year extravaganza, okay? We're going to split this episode into two. First part is going to be tonight, and then the next part is going to be next Sunday, same time, same place, you know it. And we are going to basically try our best to sum up this long year. And there's so much to say, so I don't want to talk too much. I will just let you know what we're going to talk about this part, because it's always nice to have a little surprise for next week. So we are going to talk about COVID, because how can we not? This was basically the highlight of the year for everyone. We are also going to talk about how this year showed us global conflict and also instability, wars, cold and hot. So that's going to be really interesting. And we are also going to talk about how you were fighting oppression around the world. So really good, really interesting episode. And don't forget that the next part of our review is going to be next week as well. So before we start, I want to say hi to my co-host. How are you doing, Toya?
Hey, Yara, I'm so excited for this two-part special. What better way could we have ended this crazy year? So to start off our show today, we're joined by Mick Barry, who is a TD and an elected member of Parliament in Ireland. He's a long-standing member of the Socialist Party, which is the International Socialist Alternative in Ireland. How's it going today, Mick?
It's not going too bad.
Great. Glad you could make it with us today. So, it's clear that this year marks a turning point in history. I don't think that anyone is ever going to forget 2020, the year that the pandemic, swept through the globe, and it triggered a number of crises, of course, being a pandemic, the health crises, but also the fact that we had to shut down economies. So we had, an economic downturn, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But then the social and political aspect of things this year, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw some uprisings around the world. And for a number of people, it has exposed the rotten nature of capitalism. This terrible system that we live in the pandemic, and this year has just really shown the true inequalities and oppression that we face. So despite what the capitalists say, it's not the case that everything was all good before this year and before the pandemic hit. It's not like the pandemic came and just, ruined the economy and put our healthcare in a state of crisis. All of these things were happening before, because capitalism itself has these underlying conditions. So Mick, I was wondering, before we go into talking about COVID, could we go back a bit to the state of the world before the pandemic?
Sure, yeah. So 2020 has been unforgettable, but it's probably been a year that a lot of people will want to forget. But you're right. It's interesting. Get your hands on a newspaper or go online from December the 20th, 2019, before the word coronavirus or COVID-19 entered into our daily conversation. And what you'll see a lot of newspaper stories talking about the threat of recession in 2021, talking about the growing global trade tensions as Washington squares up to Beijing and vice versa, and about how massive indebtedness of countries, of companies and individuals is beginning to reach its limits and threatening to tip the world into recession. How growth in the economy is slowing, and how 2021 could be the year of recession, and maybe not in quarter three or quarter four, more towards the first half of the year or even the first quarter. So obviously the virus, I think it crept in right at the end of 2019, but didn't really hit the headlines or become a global talking point until early 2020. And then, suddenly you have this massive international health crisis and this massive economic crisis, huge downturn in the world economy, etc. But it didn't come out of the blue. If you like, I think the COVID-19 was a tipping point and a lot of the processes that were there already were exacerbated and accelerated by it. So I think that point is right. I would agree with it.
So now we kind of remember what's happened before the pandemic hit, but then the pandemic hit, which was quite early on in in this year, and we had the first major outbreak in China, and then in January already, the city of Wuhan went into strict lockdown. I think there were a lot of people kind of praising it because it seemed like it was a fast acting response, which compared to other countries around the world was definitely a lot more fast acting. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what the responses were internationally and how were they different to the Chinese response? Was the Chinese response enough? And also, what are the interests of the ruling class when it comes to this pandemic?
I think, first of all, starting with China, China looked good to the outside world when you compared it with the reaction, say, for example, to the Trump regime in the United States. But the Trump regime's response in the United States would make any government's response look good. In China, the ruling elite in China didn't start by tackling the pandemic. They started by denying the pandemic. In fact, the people in the medical community who were whistleblowers, who said, look what's going on here, weren't just given a tap on the knuckles, they were persecuted for doing this. And the state was in denial. I mean, there was a huge state banquet in Wuhan, after the whistleblowing had been done, but before the crisis was officially recognized. I'm sure that many people got sick and many died as a result of that one particular action. It helps to be able to move quickly in one sense if you have large powers concentrated in the state and repressive powers. Of course, it would be better if you had from the bottom up democratically controlled committees making the decisions. But in some respects, you'll understand the point I'm making. With a centralization of power, they can act fast. You saw the example of that hospital that was thrown up so quickly, etc., etc. But the repressive measures weren't just used to tackle the health crisis and boost the authority of the regime. They were also used to defend corruption in the state, where you had local community activists protesting against, for example, extortionate food prices. And then you had to clamp down on them because there's an arrangement with local business people and the local Communist Party officials. So the Chinese regime's reaction, I think it did gain in prestige internationally as a result. But I think in significant measure that was because they were being compared with other regimes, particularly the Trump regime in the United States.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with this. And I think that, the way that the governments around the world have treated it is with this kind of slogan of we're all in this together. And especially in the West, we've seen that a lot. But I don't think that's true. I think this pandemic has definitely discriminated against certain people. Or it wasn't the pandemic that discriminated, but the way that the governments have handled it was what discriminated, like the effects on the working class, on the poor, on women, people of color, all of it, all of these groups of people have been disproportionately affected and to a devastating effect as well. But then we also see, even though all of us were struggling to make ends meet in this new kind of world under the pandemic, we've seen people that were benefiting from it, like, the billionaires, especially people like Jeff Bezos, that were just increasing their wealth during this horrible, hard time for most people on the planet. So why do you think there was such a dramatic difference?
Okay, well, I think there's two sides to that issue. Obviously, the argument that we're all in this together was phony, hollow, and disguised massive profiteering by the super rich, while the working class, particularly the poorest and lowest paid sections of the working class, lost out. But before dealing with that, there was a point, I think, that the ruling class realised that they couldn't handle this in a simple, straightforward, crude fashion. For example, on the question of economics, I think that huge economic crisis, usually the automatic response is to punch down and to go for austerity. I think they realised the potential for social explosions if they used the austerity card, and they had to make concessions. For example, here in Ireland, if you were unemployed as a result of the pandemic, you'd get a weekly payment of €350. It was a big cut in income for a lot of people, but it did put a certain floor on how far people were allowed to fall. I also think that the capitalist regimes were forced of necessity to go for big increases in public spending, particularly in the likes of the health services, because the health service, the neoliberal policies of the last 20 or 30 years meant that health services were unable to cope with a health crisis on this scale, and they felt the need to shore things up by going for a big increase in public spending and investing that in public health services. But of course, capitalism does work along certain grooves, and it's fixed in such a way that the rich win and the poor lose. The capitalists do well, and the majority of working people do not. And the pandemic also gave a certain twist to that. I mean, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, most likely, of workers lost their jobs, became unemployed, faced a real tough daily struggle just to keep the roof over the head, the food on the table, and the wolf from the door. But at the same time, the wealth of the billionaires increased in every country that I'm aware of, and some did particularly well. They talk about the K-shaped economy. Well, who's at the tip of the K? It's industries like big pharma, industries like big tech. The example has been given of Bezos and the incredible personal wealth that he's accumulated. And then on the other hand, particularly the lower paid and the poorer and most downtrodden sections of the working class paid a particularly strong price. The masses in the so-called third world. And I think, don't have time to go into it, but I think you'd have to highlight in particular the situation facing women, forced back into the home, and some of those homes, many of those homes, having issues with domestic violence. And there's talk now about the shadow pandemic, the silent pandemic of domestic violence that has taken place under cover of the lockdowns. And this is a really important point for the ISA and its sections to campaign and highlight on.
Thanks so much for bringing that up, Mick. We actually are going to be talking a little bit about that in our end of the year special. And we had an episode very recently with another member of our Irish section, Laura, which was a great episode talking about exactly that, what you were talking about, women being forced back into the home. But I want to change gears a little bit and talk about the consciousness of the working class right now. We've seen what the pandemic and just 2020 in general has done to people's consciousness, in the sense that they're questioning the establishment and thinking about new ways that we can move forward. And these are all positive things. But on the other hand, we have people who kind of draw opposite conclusions in these conspiracies, and that they view the problem that exists, but the reason that the problem exists is not necessarily because capitalism, and their solution is a little bit different. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. Why have people drawn these types of conclusions on both sides?
Okay, well, we'll start with the negative and the conspiracy theories. I think a huge part of it is the absence of a strong, powerful, fighting labour and trade union movement and of powerful left forces within society. The neoliberal era and the pressures that have been, imposed on people by the COVID crisis means that there's a huge discontent within society, a huge dissatisfaction, and a pointing of the finger at the people at the top, the political elites, the business elites, the people at the top dogs, and a questioning of what they say and what they do, quite rightly. If you had a powerful labour and trade union movement that was fighting on campaign, if you had powerful left forces within society, you would be able to tap into and harness, if not all of that anger, let's be realistic, but certainly the vast bulk of it, and channel it in a positive direction. In the absence of that, the anger is, I hope I use the word correctly, but I think it's a correct use of the word, inchoate, and is dispersed and can go all over the place. And some of that is embracing conspiracy theories, which, link in with very much a kind of a right, populist, anti-establishment viewpoint. There's polls now which show very significant sections of populations in various countries won't take the virus. This is linked to conspiracy theories, etc. Sometimes it's the more downtrodden and poorer sections of the working class who do this. It's not the more conscious sections or conscientious sections in a lot of cases of working people. I mean, you take the mask issue. If you're anti-mask, as far as I'm concerned, you're anti-worker. The people who will lose out from that is the man or woman who's driving your bus. It's the man or woman who was serving behind the counter in your local shop. We saw in London, I believe, several dozens of bus drivers dying as a result of the virus. Now, there's issues there with the way in which the companies put profit before their workforce. And that's the key point. But this, the practical consequences of the conspiracy theory stuff comes at a price for working people. So the workers' movement has a real interest in providing a fighting, campaigning, left alternative and championing the idea of science as opposed to the populist nonsense, which unfortunately has captured the imagination of not insignificant sections of the population. Having said that, I think that those ideas did peak somewhat during the summertime, when the virus in Europe, for example, was at somewhat of a lower ebb. And I think that as the virus has risen up again on the second wave and third wave now, and it's posed more of a health threat, I think, a big bulk of working people have embraced progressive positions on these issues, have tended to reject the conspiracy theory stuff, and I think they've been somewhat pushed back. So I think one thing that's happened now is I think that the regard for health workers in society, already high, is at an all-time high now. I think you could argue that health workers are the new vanguard of the working class, whereas maybe in more industrialized times you had, the miners, the steel workers, etc., etc. I think in terms of numbers, but also, if you like, moral authority within society, health workers in a powerful position. That underlines the increased role of women workers within society, because I think not just health workers, but teachers, workers in retail are seen as the heroes, or more precisely in many cases, the heroines of the crisis. I think the idea of socialised medicine and the idea of strong public health services will be strengthened from this, as it was from the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago. And I think for many people who are thinking about the issues, and I think this is particularly the case among the youth, I think people will draw not just anti-establishment, but anti-capitalist conclusions, seeing how the rich have benefited and the working people and the poor have got the shitty end of the stick, if you don't mind me using that expression.
Yes, I think this is a really, really important point. I think that the point about the conspiracy theories, especially, we talked about it a little bit a few weeks ago on this show. And I think the kind of the inherent kind of mistrust of workers in the system has been really obvious, but it's just about directing it into the correct places. And I think talking about this, we also obviously have the vaccines now. I think it kind of feels to a lot of people like this is kind of the end, the last kind of part of the pandemic. And I was wondering, first of all, do you think this is kind of like the vaccines and the way that the pandemic is progressing? Do you think this is kind of the light at the end of this very long tunnel that we call 2020? And do you think we can hope for a return to normal in 2021?
Well, I think if you live in Europe or in North America or maybe Japan, that you might have light at the end of the tunnel. But I think that the masses of ordinary people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are going to be forced to wait for longer, and in many cases go to the back of the queue. We'll see how things progress with the vaccine. I'm a bit skeptical about some claims from capitalist politicians that it'll all be done and dusted by the end of the second quarter next year. I think it may take longer than that and stretch throughout the year. But as the health issues begin to be resolved or pushed back, I think the economic issues are going to come more to the fore. Huge numbers of companies in every country which have only been sustained by state aid. And as the state aid is withdrawn, you're going to see a lot of company collapses. You're going to see mass employment. That'll be particularly the case among the youth. And then the new crises will begin to present themselves, not just economic, but the climate crisis, which has been obscured from view a little bit, if you don't live in Australia or a couple of other countries, is going to come centre stage, I think, particularly towards the end of the year and that big gathering in Glasgow.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mick. It's always good to have you on, and we're excited to hear what 2021 brings for you and your elected position and everything that you're doing in Ireland. So thanks again for joining us.
So I think part of this new period that 2020 opened up is unfortunately a new era of nationalism. And we also saw a lot of conflict between capitalist and imperialist powers, which is very unfortunate and quite scary, I think, to be living in a time that has crisis coming from every angle. And I think this was the case before the pandemic, but it's now kind of been turbocharged and it's really been everywhere in the past year. So I think the dominant aspect, like the one that we see the most and is maybe in many ways the most interesting one, is the new Cold War that we've talked about a lot on World to Win this year. But we've also seen a lot of hot wars, and we've seen new conflicts opening up. We've seen old conflicts being brought back from the dead, and most recently we've seen Ethiopia. We featured that on our episode last week, and we've seen loads happen. So we're here with Rob Jones from the ISA to talk about this. How are you doing, Rob?
Yara, it's pleased to meet you, and I hope you have a good new year. It's going to be exciting, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that as well. But before we go in there, I want to ask you, so it seems like it was so long ago now, but and I think in many ways I was surprised to realize that it happened this year and not the year before. But 2020 started with a bang. We've had the US assassination of the Iranian Major General Soleimani, and we've also seen the threat of war kind of starting up with Iran. And fortunately, it was pulled back from the brink. But I think the situation is clearly still unresolved. The Biden administration is going to try probably to adopt a more conciliatory approach. Iran has still extremists being strengthened, and obviously we've seen Israel as a factor pushing for a more combative approach to Iran. Sort out this mess for us. Can you remind us what's been happening at the start of this year?
Well, yeah, I think you are right. It's been a long while since the killing of Soleimani, it seems, but it has been, as you say, just a year. And of course, the year finished with the latest assassination of the nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, if I pronounced his name correctly. And it really demonstrates how dangerous the whole situation is. And it's against the background, of course, that in Iran itself, you have huge anger against corruption, against price increases. You had the brutal crackdown on protests. I was going to say a few months ago, but just over a year ago now, reflected, of course, in the low turnout in this year's election. But this isn't true just in Iran. It's true in many, many countries across the world. And what we're actually seeing is a polarization of the situation. On the one side, you have people who are getting extremely angry at living standards of corruption and so on. They're very dissatisfied. And on the other side, you have the ruling elite is becoming more determined, in many cases, more hardline. And of course, this isn't a simple equation. Who is going to win out in this battle will be decided not by some formula in some academic classroom, but it will be decided on the streets in struggle as to how firmly the workers and the youth can resist these regimes. And I think we're seeing this not just in Iran, we've seen it in, for example, other parts of the Middle East, with the process of so-called normalization between Netanyahu's Israeli regime and the reactionary Arab states. They're all happily signing pieces of paper and basically signing away the interests of the Palestinian masses. And they, of course, are going to have to resist this process as well. Now, I think it's true that Trump has pushed these agreements. He's been behind a lot of the instability that we've seen in the last period. His gung-ho nationalism has done immense damage to world relations. And this is all in the midst of the worst public health crisis for decades. He even went as far as pulling the US out of the World Health Organization. But I don't think Biden is going to be much better. I think other speakers have already said this. Biden is inheriting a world more scarred by instability and distrust thanks to Trump in the context of a massive economic crisis. I don't think he'll bring out any fundamental change. He may restore some damage, or at least try to. Maybe he will rejoin the World Health Organization. He may try and resurrect the Paris Climate Accord. But the Paris Climate Accord is already meaningless when climate change has already gone so far. Just as an aside, for example, this week, I was talking to supporters of ISA in Georgia, not the American state, the Caucasian country. And they were telling me that apart from having tens of thousands of refugees from previous ethnic conflicts in the country, you also have now tens of thousands of so-called eco-refugees in Georgia living in slums around the major cities who have been forced out of the hills because of climate warming already, because there's been flooding and so on, and it's no longer safe to live there. And so we're having all these crises accumulating. I think in some ways, so Biden is going to be more dangerous than even Trump, in the sense that Biden has a more direct strategy to defend US interests. As one of his advisors put it recently, we're talking about China, 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 and Russia. Just a couple of examples to demonstrate this. Today, we had the warning from the Pentagon that US maritime forces will respond more forcibly to acts of aggression and breaches of international law, and by that he meant China. Microsoft this week have warned of hacking attacks against agencies responsible for the US nuclear weapons stockpile and coronavirus medicines. They're probably talking about Russia and China when they talk about this. But it should be underlined as well, Yara, that other imperialist powers too are sharpening their weapons. Facebook has just exposed, for example, the cynical cyber warfare tactics of the French military and the Russian military, who are facing off against each other in the Central African Republic. The world that we have now is so unstable. There are so many different conflicts being provoked by imperialism and by the local capitalists that we really have to think about how we're going to move to change it.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really good point. It's easy to forget that they're not just the imperialist powers that we always talk about. But that being said, I still want to talk about them a little bit more before we move on. So I think the kind of the new Cold War is something that has been really present in the last year. And I think we've seen a lot of commentators calling it various different names. I think it's very important that we say that it's not that political phenomenon, like a lot of them were saying, you know, it's not because of Trump or because of Xi Jinping. It's because of a deeper process that reflects kind of the decline of US imperialism in the world. And I think it's also important to mention that it's also driven by economic factors. And I think the points that you made about Biden are really crucial in here, because it's easy to kind of dismiss it and saying, okay, it's just Trump is crazy, we're moving on from that now. But it's not the case. The Biden administration isn't going to fundamentally change this. And I think it's also not just about a conflict between two countries, it's also about regional and global influence as well, and domination. It's an imperialist war at the end of the day. And I think in 2020, we've seen this intensify massively, like especially the trade and tech war as well, like with Huawei, and we've seen other sanctions as well. And I think the tensions in the South China Sea and also in Taiwan are really big ones too. And we've seen all of the other countries kind of backing certain parts of this imperialist war. So I was wondering, I think it's a question that scares us all, but is the Cold War going to be a hot war in 2021?
Well, I think when we look back on 2020, we will see it as a year of tipping points. It's become modern to talk about tipping points in the climate with the burning of the Amazon and the melting of the Siberian permafrost, or a tipping point as being the year when people say we no longer will tolerate poor and commercialized healthcare. But I think we'll look back on 2022 as a year of tipping points in the economy. There are major economic changes taking place in the world at the moment. And it's these conflicts between economic powers. They've always been a feature of capitalism. But when the economy is growing, they take a certain back seat. But yes, this year has been the most devastating economic crisis for decades, at least in the what they call now the advanced capitalist countries. If you remember, it was Clausewitz who once said, "If war is the continuation of that war is the continuation of politics by other means." I would rephrase that a little bit, meaning exactly the same. And then politics reflects the economics. War is economics distilled, and that is what we're seeing now. As the world is escalating further into economic difficulties, we're seeing each of the world leaders looking after their own interests. The world leaders can talk as much as they like about the virus ending maybe in the summer or by the end of next year, and then the world will go back to normal, the economy will go back to normal. But that's words only at face value. In reality, the situation is going to be completely different. And I think this will unfold as a contradictory process. Sometimes it will seem we're moving in one direction and then the opposite. But the dominant trend is, Yara, I agree with you, that there will be an increase in conflict between the US and China. It will be a conflict in the first place between their economic situations. And it raises the prospect of a new Cold War. What sort of examples can I give to back that up? Well, I think, first of all, US corporations have been forced to toe the line. If you are a supplier now to Google or to Facebook, you have to prove that the supplier is not providing a product produced in China. You have the battle over the 5G technology. We have the conflict, the so-called vaccine war, not only as who is first to produce the vaccine, whose vaccine is the most effective, but also who actually is able to buy the vaccine. And we're seeing increasingly, in my opinion, attempts to retrench supply chains so that they're nearer home. It's escalated by the vaccine war. The European Union has discussed bringing the pharmaceutical supply chains closer to Europe. The New Deal that has been trumpeted by China, the RCEP, in the recent week or so, has spoken about regionalizing the supply chain, so the China supply chains are from that region. And of course, the US is doing exactly the same. And it's accompanied by increasingly nationalist rhetoric on all sides. Mike Pompeo, I know he doesn't have that long left in office, but he's talking about defending ourselves from the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. Just a few years ago, they were quite happy to see China as a partner. I can never pronounce his name right, but Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, talks of meeting the invader in the language it understands. And I think there is going to be no letting off of such language. Now, I think you're right. Against this background, we're seeing an increase in hotspots across the world. I think it is probably unlikely at least in the next few years, that we will have an open war between the major imperialist powers, in the sense of troops massing on each other's borders, throwing bombs at each other openly. But we're certainly going to see a whole number of other conflicts breaking out.
Yeah, so this has been super interesting, and you're talking a lot about this Cold War, going on between the imperialist powers. But I mean, a lot of people, I know here in the US, and I'm assuming in other parts of the world, are unaware of the actual, we're calling it hot war here, actual battles that are happening around the world. Many people are unaware, whether it be, as you were, alluding to in the India Chinese border battle, in Armenia. We had a demonstration here in Boston about what's going on in Armenia. And then we've talked about on our show what's going on currently in Ethiopia. So for especially our viewers who may be unaware of these conflicts that are happening because the corporate media is not covering it as much as they should, what's going on, in these wars around the world?
There's often not much information about these conflicts taking place. It tends to be covered in the regional media rather than international media. Some of the conflicts, of course, are at the moment potential conflicts, like in the South Chinese Sea or in the East Mediterranean. But other conflicts are certainly getting to be very hot. As far as the people who are living in those areas are concerned, they are brutal conflicts. For example, we've just had the 6-week war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh is a small Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan in the Caucasus, used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now, during the course of that 6-week conflict, thousands of people have been killed, houses have been destroyed. It has left tens of thousands of refugees. On this occasion, it's mainly Armenian refugees who have had to flee back to Armenia. But in previous phases of this conflict, you've had nearly 600,000 Azerbaijani refugees fled the region in the war 30 years ago. And you don't have to scratch very far under the surface of these conflicts to find out that it's really a battle over resources. For example, if you look at the East Mediterranean conflict or potential conflict, that has developed after the discovery of hydrocarbon resources in the Mediterranean Sea. You know how Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, Israel, other Middle Eastern powers all arguing over who has control. You have French, American and Russian warships all controlling the sea in that area. And of course, politics also plays a role. The recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, I wouldn't say it's the first conflict for 30 years, but it's certainly the most serious conflict for 30 years that followed the restoration of capitalism in that area. But you have to ask, well, why now? Why did that break out this year? And if you look at it, what you find is that in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, and in Turkey, which has been Azerbaijan's main backer in this war, both countries have been extremely badly affected by economic crisis. You have in Turkey, for example, at the moment, you have 25% unemployment, inflation at over 20%. You have a devaluation of the lira by 30%. And you had government crisis in both countries with a conflict between the authoritarian rulers and their, if you like, their second layer of supporters within their parties. And it's a good way to divert public attention. Have a short victorious war, you build up a patriotic mood, and people forget about their problems. Of course, Armenia now is in a terrible situation. It has to cope with tens of thousands of conflicts. Now, you would think that Nagorno-Karabakh is somewhere that really, with all respect to people in the region, a region that the big imperialist powers are not really interested in. But Pompeo in the last weeks has flown to Ankara. From Ankara, he flew to Tbilisi, which is the capital of the other the other Caucasian country, for negotiations, which were aimed at strengthening an alliance between Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, because they have an oil pipeline controlled by the US flowing through the countries, to make sure that the three are consolidated against Russia. So you have all sorts of factors coming into play. You have a desire by the people to live in peace in a normal economic situation. Nagorno-Karabakh wants self-determination. It should have the right to have it. But the capitalist imperialist interests won't allow it because they're more interested in exploiting the resources on both sides themselves. And this is a situation that seems to be developing across the world in a whole number of areas. The US has a think tank that lists all the potential hotspots that it thinks can break out into conflict that will affect the US in the coming period. They list 26 different hotspots. There will be no major direct conflict between the imperialist powers with trenches on both sides fighting each other, in my opinion, at least in the next period. But you are certainly going to have loads of small proxy wars that, for the people who live in those areas, are hot wars, and you desperately need an answer to fight those wars.
Speaking of that answer, we're asking all our guests here today to take out their crystal ball and predict what's going to happen in 2021. I'm half joking, but it's important for us to talk about our perspectives and where we see struggle breaking out in the coming year. So, Rob, what do you think will happen, and what do you think also needs to happen in 2021?
Well, I'd like to try and relate this as much as possible to what has been happening as well over the past, because as you say, it's a crystal ball, but we're Marxists as well. We would like to have some understanding in what we predict. I think what was remarkable in the past year is the fact that there have been so many protests in different countries. Many of them have not even been reported in the international press. I think what was remarkable was even at the height of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, when there was massive nationalistic moods whipped up on both sides of the conflict, you had groups of Azerbaijani youth and actually Armenian feminists who made public statements criticizing imperialism's role in developing the war and calling for a joint struggle against the war. And I think, as an aside, the ISA would very much like to work with groups in those countries and any other countries that are struggling to find an end to a war. I think, given the dramatic economic crisis, the continuing COVID lockdowns, I think it's inevitable we will see mass struggles by medical workers. I know in my own section of the ISA, we're discussing our plans to intervene in the medical colleges and so on, so that we can build our support in this space. And it is inevitable that people will come into struggle. We saw at the end of 2019, I'm sure we've already commented on this, in Chile, in Bolivia, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Hong Kong, big protests. They seem a long while ago. But what is remarkable, how quickly protests have returned. I know yourself, you were actively involved in the Black Lives Matters movement. That has had a huge global echo. In Nigeria, we've seen the anti-SARS protests. I bet you anything you like, it hasn't been reported in almost any major country in the press, but Albania in the past week has suffered 5 days of unrest after the police shot somebody breaking a curfew, an unarmed man breaking a curfew. And of course, we've seen spectacular protests already this year: Chile, Guatemala, Bolivia. What has not been reported, we've seen spectacular protests, well, actually some have been reported now, but across East and Central Europe. And that is something new. For 30 years, these countries have suffered the horrors of the restoration of capitalism. We went through the 90s. The 90s in Eastern Europe was as bad as the 1930s in the US, in the economy and in the degradation of society. People have been turned away from protest, from organization because of that. But now a new layer of youth are coming through, 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. And there have been a wave of protest across Eastern Europe, the most spectacular, of course, in Poland and in Belarus. And I think it's worth commenting what will happen in Belarus, because this is a forerunner of what is going to happen in a lot of countries, in my opinion. You've had people there who rose and have been heroically struggling now for 3 months and are still coming out onto the streets, maybe in fewer numbers, but they are still carrying on. I think there are some very important lessons that we have to take on board. First of all, it was a spontaneous movement. Nobody called these people out onto the streets. They saw that Lukashenko, the authoritarian president, claimed he had 40% in the election, but they still came out. They've involved working class, women, youth, students, pensioners, everybody. Most important, you've seen the role of the working class. But what has been missing, of course, has been organisation and a left-wing socialist force. And that is what the ISA is trying to build and what we intend to build in the future.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I think this point, the points that you've made here are so incredibly important. Like, I feel like every time we talk about any aspect of this year, we come back to that point of all of these international movements against all of the things that have been happening. And I think it's really crucial that we kind of have as many people join our forces internationally, even if we don't have a section or activists in your local area. Please contact us still, and we can help, and we can connect with your group, or you can start a section where you are. I think it's incredibly important to prepare for those movements that are going to continue happening in 2021. So thank you so much, Rob, for being here. It's always really fascinating to talk about this with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yara.
So for our next guests, we have Anja from Belgium and Eljeer from New York. We're going to ask them both a few questions. But before we get started, I just want to preface by saying, we've talked a little bit today, but 2020 has seen these enormous struggles. And now specifically, we're going to talk about struggles of oppression that have taken place around the globe. And to be honest, some of them are the most radical that we've seen in years, around the world. Whether it was the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, to the fight for abortion rights in Poland, we've seen hundreds of millions of people who have said enough is enough when it comes to racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these things, all of these types of oppression that are really built into the DNA of capitalism. So I want to start with Anja. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of women specifically during this pandemic and how it's intensified the oppression that we already experience under capitalism?
Yes. One of the worst consequences of the pandemic and the lockdowns for women became clear almost immediately. It's this enormous spike in domestic violence that is described as the shadow pandemic. Women and children locked in their house with an abusive partner or father saw the degree of violence rise. And in the UK, for instance, domestic abuse killings has doubled. But the untenable pressure on families of the restrictions, the loss of income, the insecurity about the future, schools being closed, people having to work remote with the kids present, social services being shut, and so on, made for violence developing in families where that had not been the case before. But the pandemic enhanced all problems that women were already facing before. Violence, obviously, but also the number of hours women work at home in unpaid labor. This double task became untenable with schools and childcare closed, with healthcare overwhelmed as well, and non-COVID care postponed, which meant that people who were in need of care had to stay at home and had to be cared for at home. And this highlighted the importance of these services in order for women to be able to work, but also the fact that all over the world, these services have been cut back to the bone, really, in the decades of austerity that came before. But while it had an overall negative effect on the position of women, it also highlighted the importance of women's work to keep society functioning. We will all remember from this year the images of the exhausted health workers, the heroes of our time, although they would probably say that they were martyred. They had to go into the pandemic without sufficient PPE, with a shortage of staff that sent them into double shifts for months on end, and many of them having to work while having been tested positive for COVID. Together with teachers who all over the world had to turn to online classes and rearrange their work totally, often without any extra means, they've been the workers who've already started to protest and demands for more means to be invested in their sector. And in several countries, governments had to concede extra investment and pay rises to health workers, and the struggle still continues. It is a striking feature that the workers we have now come to know as essential workers, many of them women, are basically all underpaid, understaffed, and overlooked. Not just teachers and healthcare workers, but also the mainly feminine staff in food distribution, cleaners, and so on, have organized workplace protests to impose safe working conditions and also often to get special bonuses. And when supermarket bosses in Belgium tried to get rid of these bonuses between the two waves of the virus, spontaneous actions and strike forced them back in a matter of days, showing the heightened consciousness about the essential nature of their work and the biggest support they get in society. But on the other side of the spectrum is the fact that women and also other discriminated against groups like immigrant workers, national minorities, are overrepresented in many of the services that are now facing an avalanche of job losses and closures, with bosses even trying not to pay workers legally established severance pay. And the determined struggle of the Debenham workers in Ireland shows the world that we don't have to take this lying down, but that we'll have to fight and fight hard to get anything we need. More and more articles appear in the press with titles as "Young Women Face the Brunt of Indian Economic Downturn." In Belgium, the loss of income for women this year is double that of men. And in many countries, this twin crisis of the pandemic and the developing economic depression led to a situation in which poor women's life expectancy has already declined, and we're only at the start of the development of depression. And that brings us back to the question of domestic violence, because the economic downturn hitting women worse than men will profoundly affect the economic independence of large layers of women, making them vulnerable for violence. And struggle will be needed for job creation, also through a shorter working week without loss of pay, for decent wages and contracts, for affordable housing, and for massive investment in good quality public services, to prevent that in this economic depression, the clock is turned back a number of decades on women's emancipation. And that is a clear risk in the present situation. Already different right-wing governments have used the pandemic and the lockdowns to attack fundamental rights of women, and they will continue to do that. The only real response to all these problems is to organize and fight back, as the women in Poland have shown us in such a magnificent way.
I think this is really important to talk about, and I'm really happy that we're talking about it now, because we kind of touched upon it a little bit when we talked about COVID generally. But I wanted to ask specifically about kind of the effect of people of color, because I know that in the US, for example, there's been a disproportionate effect in relation to health, but also economically. I think it's important, and we always stress how this pandemic isn't just, a health crisis. It's also an economic crisis. It's also a political crisis, and many other crises like we've been discussing today, and like we're going to discuss next week as well. I think it's a trend that's been seen everywhere. In the UK, there's been proven higher death rates amongst the Black, Asian, minority ethnic population. And we've seen in Latin America as well, indigenous groups are hit harder by this pandemic. So Eljeer, why do you think this is the case?
Well, I think it starts out, first, we have to have a historical framework. These are communities, these are people that have been denied access to healthcare for decades. We have the Affordable Care Act in the United States, known to all as Obamacare. But still, there's 30 to 40 million people without any healthcare insurance at all. You may be seen by a doctor, but you will have these enormous medical bills at the end of your care. And so, there's the question of not just access, but also having clinics and hospitals in the areas to which you live. Here in New York, where I'm born and raised, from 2000 to now, we've had 21 hospitals shut down, closed, because they were not making a profit at the end of the day. And so we're talking about when COVID hit, you had basically the elimination of thousands of ICU beds. You had the elimination of PPE, of ancillary staff, of nursing staff, and it hits communities of color, it hits communities like the indigenous population who live on reservations, who are already they lack clean water, lack jobs, deep in poverty, alcoholism, on and on and on. So when you have this pandemic hitting as it hit the United States, it will affect the most disadvantaged, the most marginalized in society, because clearly we've lived under neoliberal capitalism for decades, heightened certainly under the Clinton administration, continued through Bush, Obama, Trump, and now soon to be Joe Biden. And so what they've attempted to do is that we are supposed to live a dignified life with less. And so COVID-19 really exposed the crisis of neoliberal capitalism on one side, but also the crisis of healthcare and how healthcare has not been really developed in a way where we can deal with these questions, not just of the pandemic, but in fact, preventive medicine. And that's one of the key questions facing, I think, the American working class, particularly communities of color.
Thanks so much, Eljeer. Yeah, all of these experiences, have been bubbling beneath the surfaces. But just like we saw, back when Michael Brown was killed, after George Floyd was killed, we saw, an explosions of movement. Not that he was, exceptionally different than when in February of early last year, Ahmaud Arbery was killed, or when Breonna Taylor was murdered, in the middle of the night in her own apartment. But in Minneapolis, we saw the movement kind of grow after the death of George Floyd. And Black Lives Matter, it spread very quickly, not just across the US, but around the entire world. So can you talk a little bit more, Eljeer, about the significance of this movement and how and why it got taken up in different countries so quickly, as opposed to the last time after Michael Brown was killed?
Right. Well, I think it's a continuum of the 2019 struggles, rebellions that took place around the world, from Bolivia to Chile, Hong Kong. And certainly people would have thought, what about the United States? Powder keg with Trump in office and the kind of conditions that the American working class poor and the oppressed face on a daily basis. And so when George Floyd was murdered, and, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a law enforcement officer with his knee on his neck and 2 other officers on his body, preventing him to move. I think it was a stark reality for so many, not just in the United States, but around the world, that working class people are being held down by a system of oppression and exploitation. And so what we saw, that mass explosion, not just in the United States, but globally, is an extension of 2019, but also, I think, a deep-rooted solidarity that exists among the working class and the poor internationally. And I think from slave traders, statues being torn down in Boston, Britain, from solidarity protests from Hong Kong, Puerto Rico, on and on, it showed the possibilities of working people coming together, and that we have a common history. And in fact, when we think about the slave trade, this last year, we commemorated the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans brought to the United States. The transatlantic slave trade has many countries involved in that process. And so that's a linked legacy. It's a linked history, and it ties into the development of global capitalism and global racism that manifests itself in different forms in different countries, that I think brought the commonality, brought an understanding to the wider layers of the working class and the poor, and particularly young people who I believe have no patience for oppression, for exploitation, for violence against working people. There's a commonality thread of environmental destruction that's taking place that we're living through. So that's the politics. And George Floyd was just a match that I think ignited a new type of an imagination, and I think took BLM to a higher level, particularly when you saw the budgetary questions being raised around defund the police or even dismantle the police, that is of a higher character conversation than 2014, 15, and 16. And that allows us, revolutionary Marxists and international socialists, to start to talk about this is a global crisis. This is a systematic issue that we're dealing with here, and that we've had 8 minutes and 46 seconds our entire lives being choked out by capitalism.
I think this is an incredibly important point. And I think, what you're describing about how we as Marxists see the connection and see how discrimination and oppression is part and parcel with the system. Like, how you described with slavery and the connection to racism and how it was, so important to the development of capitalism. I think it's also relevant when we talk about like the climate, like you said, and also when we talk about women's oppression. Like we talked about this a few weeks ago on the show about kind of the origin of the family, private property, and the state, and how that connects to women's oppression and how the system benefits from it and the system created it. And I think this kind of higher political level was present in all of the movements that we've seen against oppression this year. I think it was very clear. So, for example, in Poland, and where Anja mentioned that before, and in the movement against, in the movement for abortion in Poland, we saw much wider slogans. Like there was a slogan that says, "I wish I could abort my government," which I think is a really high level of analysis. So I want to ask you, Anja, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of inspiring movements that we've seen like against women's oppression throughout the year, and kind of like what, because I think the point that Eljeer made about how global the movements have been and also how important it is for them to be international. Can you also tell us about the impact that they had on one another?
So if we're looking at the movements of this year, then really it has been a really strange year in the sense that the divide between before the pandemic and after the arrival of the pandemic was visually clear. This year started with the continuation of mass mobilizations, with massive women's marches all over Iraq, and massive mobilizations against the anti-Muslim law in India, in which women played a massive role. And around the 8th of March, International Women's Day, there were impressive demonstrations in Chile with more than 1 million participants, or the massive national women's strike in Mexico as a response to the huge number of femicides, but also the biggest demonstration in the history of the country. And in Argentina as well, we saw this massive strike. And in many European countries, demonstrations were a lot bigger than they were in the years before. And we saw that the women's movement already on the 8th of March spread out further with actions in Kyrgyzstan, in Albania, where we saw big mobilizations against gender violence. 2020 was also the year in which the international women's movement adopted its own international anthem with the Chilean Rapists on Your Path, which was first performed on the 25th of November 2019, showing the consciousness among women about the systemic nature of women's oppression, the criminal role of governments, of police, of justice departments, the links between the capitalist system and women's oppression. It shows that broader layers start to understand that there is simply no capitalism without sexism. They just belong together. They are intertwined. But then the pandemic hit and images of protest started to look very differently, with actions that practice social distancing and the disappearance a bit during a while of mass demonstrations, with many organizations going over to virtual action on social media. In China, where more than 1 in 4 women are estimated to have suffered domestic violence, this virtual action is very widespread and ongoing. And in September in Iran, we saw the start of their Me Too movement also on social media. But also street action, notwithstanding the risk of the virus and the official restrictions quickly came back to the agenda. Already in April in Bangladesh, textile workers hit the street to demand the payment of their wages, which was suspended because the orders of the Western companies had been cancelled. In June, a new women's strike took place in Switzerland. In July, women protested against the new cabinet that was installed in France and contained one new minister who was accused of rape and another minister who publicly spoke out against Me Too. But the movement that has given heart and courage to women worldwide was definitely the absolutely magnificent and massive response against the Polish government attempt to make the abortion completely illegal. For days on end, these images of these massive mobilizations were spread all over the world, and in many countries, solidarity action took place. And other recent images that show women's resistance and determination, and that gives us hope, was the role that women played in the massive protests in Belarus. I recently saw this quite widespread video of a protest of women attacked by thugs in alliance with the security forces, where the women on the protest did not allow for this intimidation. They just went to those thugs, took off their masks, and then they went running. And these are the kind of images that really warm my heart. This central and frontline role of women in more general mass protest movements was also clear in Thailand's pro-democracy movements. And it is a continuation of a feature that was already clear in all mass revolts we saw in 2019. Those who hope that women's resistance will stop or diminish should definitely think again.
Thanks so much. This has been an excellent segment, talking about the struggle against different types of oppression, whether it's racism or the fight against women's oppression. It's super important that we continue this discussion. In 2020, the International Socialist Alternative launched the Rosa campaign, which is happening all across the world. And I encourage, everyone, women, men, anyone, to join Rosa. Find a Rosa section near you or start one, and you can find it in the link below. So before we head out, Anja, I wanted to ask you, what do you see in the coming year? We've been talking today on our show about what has happened previously, and we got to go into 2021 with a positive attitude. Hopefully, it's a better year than we had last year. But where do you see the movement going in 2021?
I think the very quick resurgence of the women's movement after the heavy blow of the pandemic, the fact that the movement has continued to spread to new countries and regions of the world in such difficult circumstances, tells us a lot about what we should expect for 2021. First, preparations for the 8th of March in Belgium have started this week with our kickoff meeting to start this campaign. And after the holidays, Rosa, International Socialist Feminists, will start preparations as well. And you definitely need to get in touch with Rosa and International Socialist Alternative if you want to participate in making next International Women's Day a day of struggle. Another element that will continue is the convergence of struggles. Women play a massive role in all general protest movements and revolts against inequality, against the billionaire class and their agents in capitalist governments all over the world. And also in the re-emergence of working class struggle with the frontline role in workplace struggle played by the workers in the highly feminized essential sectors. So on our agenda in Belgium in March is not just the 8th of March, but also the very important second big demonstration of health workers called by the collective Santé en Lutte for the 13th of March. So I think as this year closes, it is very clear that everywhere the struggle for next year is already being prepared.
I think this is we can't stress enough how important this is to kind of join us and work with us. And I know that March seems so far away now at the end of this long year, but it's really not. So we have a lot of prep to do. We have a lot can happen as well in between. So we really need to push for it. And I was wondering, Eljeer, can you also give us kind of your predictions for 2021? What's going to happen? What should be happening?
Well, I think we will see a continuum of the struggle that we've been facing, and we'll have a new president, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the vice president. Will they have a honeymoon? Will they be able to deal still with the residue of COVID-19, the economic crisis that the United States and the globe is facing? And then, of course, the ever-present character of racial oppression in U.S. society. That will not go away anytime soon. And with the emergence of this new socialist movement that is developing, is in this very embryonic form, I think 2021 will continue to be a powder keg of social explosion, of deeper class polarization, and also of capitalist exploitation. And so the rebuilding of the socialist movement, taking on racism, taking on environmental destruction, taking on sexism and homophobia will be key elements in pushing back the neoliberal agenda of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I think 2021 will be a hot year.
I think that's fair to say that it really is going to be, even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen, I think, like you said, oppression is not going to go away. It's not going away as long as we have capitalism, as long as we live in like a class system. So it's really important that when we fight oppression, we fight in the socialist way. And I think the movements, like we talked about, against oppression have made this huge shift in consciousness towards that. And I'm looking forward to 2021 and seeing what's going to happen then. So thank you so much, Anja, and thank you so much, Eljeer, for coming and talking to us about this. I think we've learned so much, and now we can be really excited about the end of this year, even more so than before.
So I want to thank Eljeer and Anja and all of our guests that were on our show today. We're going to continue with this discussion next week. If you are a first-time viewer of our show, make sure you subscribe to our channel and like this video, and also check out our website and consider joining the International Socialist Alternative. And for everyone else, we'll see you next week, same time, same place.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!